Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have great pleasure in introducing the Government's programme for the coming session. Everywhere today, men and women, many of them young, yearn to be productive. They are ready to work because very often a life of unemployment is no life at all. Now, political leaders owe it to these young people to create the conditions that encourage growth. With growth comes work, with work comes security and confidence. With confidence comes prosperity and a deeper sense of well-being, not just for individuals and families, but for the wider community. That is how we create the good society, the fair society, and it is the heart of the programme for government that I outlined today. Recent events in Europe and the United States have highlighted the fragility of the global recovery. Indeed, some are even suggesting that another cold blast of recession threatens the world, certainly threatens the Western economies. Now, while I do believe we can continue to grow, the very fact that double dip is at the door is in part due to the mistakes of those who have choked recovery with their obsession with early deficit reduction rather than growth. The fact is that failure to grow leads to failure in reducing deficits. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, the former World Bank chief economist, said in January of this year that the gravest threat to recovery came from the wave of austerity sweeping the world, and particularly in Europe. He will take no pleasure that his prophecy seems to be coming to pass. But there is still time to take his advice and to tackle the vicious downward spiral of debt and depression. Market pressure is often cited to vindicate irresponsible cuts. But if the markets hate one thing more than debt, they hate lack of growth. Failure to grow means we shall never break out of the debt spiral. And that is why this government have consistently argued against the deep cuts in capital spending being imposed by the Westminster government. Professor Stiglitz says we can stimulate growth and employment in the long term with a large-scale public investment programme now. This government agrees with him and has tried to do that despite the refusal of London to recognise the views clearly expressed by the people of Scotland in May and give us the economic tools that we need. Here in Scotland, we want the kind of economic levers that allow us to fully implement Professor Stiglitz's advice. We've argued strongly against the Coalition's plans to cut our capital investment by nearly 40% in real terms over the course of the spending review. It is economically illiterate and endangers recovery. Now, this Parliament has heard the voice of the people and already backed our calls for improvements to the Scotland Bill that will transform its job-creating powers that we need in this chamber. It is now time for the United Kingdom Government to hear and to act accordingly. But waiting for London to show humility and recognise the democratic mandate of the Scottish people is not enough to deal with the urgent need to boost growth. Using the powers we do have, we took action through our economic recovery plan that meant a recession in Scotland that was shorter and shallower than for the UK as a whole. Scottish unemployment is also lower than the UK, while employment is higher. But we cannot allow decisions made elsewhere to threaten that progress. That's why this programme for government will focus on ways we can stimulate growth. This objective will also be central to plans that ministers will place before this chamber in coming weeks. John Swinney will publish a new government economic strategy, followed by the spending review, allocating the Scottish budget. There's no better articulation of our competence in government than John Swinney's record in managing the public finances. Our first priority is that the new plan is promoting capital investment in the economy. Our previous decision to accelerate capital spending was a considerable success, with growth in construction jobs of 11.6% over the year to the first quarter of 2011, compared to a fall in the United Kingdom as a whole. At the end of June, we opened the M74, set to generate as many as 20,000 jobs for our economy over the years ahead of schedule and some £15 to £20 million under budget. We will deliver key infrastructure projects such as the Glasgow South Hospitals project, the Forth Replacement Crossing, which will on its own support 3,000 jobs. We will take forward a new housing investment programme, which is starting with our £400 million housing investment budget for this year, which is estimated to support over 15,000 jobs across the country. and we will support additional investment for alternative funding streams such as the £2.5 billion non-profit distributing programme and use of tax incremental financing. The infrastructure is more than about bricks and mortar. We are aware of the disappointment that followed the UK Government's announcement of broadband funding that took far too little account of Scotland's greater geographical area and the very poor connectivity in so many of our rural areas. And therefore, to this end, we will launch the Next Generation Digital Fund to help business activity, particularly in these rural areas. The second way to assist economic recovery is to improve access to finance. We have a blockage at the moment, with many large companies holding significant amounts of capital, but many of our smaller and most dynamic companies constrained by an inability to secure affordable finance from our banks. To address this, we have established the Scottish Investment Bank, which is now open and lending to Scottish companies. Yesterday, I announced an investment in Akukanosticks, a life sciences business seeking to grow internationally from its base in Forres and creating much-needed and well-paid and highly skilled jobs in that community. However, the Scottish Investment Bank cannot take the place of bank lending, as the total resource available to it is some £200 million, compared to Scotland's share of Project Merlin lending for small and medium-sized businesses of £6.5 billion. And therefore, we continue to press the banks and the UK Government to improve the supply of finance. We must also release the wall of private sector capital, which is currently being held back by the lack of investment opportunities. One key area where there is significant scope to leverage such investment is in offshore renewables, where we have a unique opportunity to reindustrialise this country. Scotland has around a quarter of Europe's offshore wind and tidal energy potential and an estimated 10% of the wave power capacity. And therefore, our £70 million National Renewables Infrastructure Fund will leverage private sector investment to support offshore renewables and ensure that Scotland becomes Europe's green energy powerhouse. And thousands of jobs will be the result in communities around Scotland. Thirdly, we must restore confidence among both businesses and consumers. Our policy of no compulsory redundancies for staff under whom we have direct responsibility has helped provide economic confidence. If people are more secure, they spend money, it boosts demands right across the economy. We will continue to deliver the most competitive business tax policy in the United Kingdom, including the Small Business Bonus Scheme, which has removed or reduced the rates burden for tens of thousands of small business properties. Our social wage serves a similar purpose. Free education, free prescriptions, free concessionary travel, frozen council tax bills and water bills help maintain demand by offsetting, at least in part, a work wage that is often reducing in real terms for many of our fellow citizens. We still need the United Kingdom to show the same kind of initiative and come forward with a plan B for boosting business growth. However, the Scottish Government will not wait for the UK to show initiative. That would be a hazardous policy and indeed a long wait. A jobs agenda, therefore, is at the very heart of this programme for government. We are committed to doing everything in our powers to reduce youth unemployment, which has fallen by 2,000 in the last year. It has fallen, but it remains far, far, far too high. We have responded with a range of initiatives, including providing almost 300,000 training opportunities since 2007, including a record 25,000 modern apprenticeships this year, which we now commit to for every single year of this Parliament. That annual level is some 60% higher than when we came to office. We will, of course, ensure that access to higher education is based in Scotland on the ability to succeed rather than the ability to pay. We will maintain bursary support to help young people remain engaged in college and training. We will invest in 14,500 pre-employment training opportunities, and we shall continue to fund the educational maintenance allowance for young people in school and college. Our key commitment is to these young people who, as I said, yearn to be productive. No young person should go through school to become an unemployment statistic at the age of 16. We will not allow that in Scotland. We already have 85% of school leavers going on to positive outcomes. That is employment, education or training. The 125,000 modern apprenticeships over 5 years will build on that success. But the strength of Scottish apprenticeships is their linkage to a real job. So expanding that beyond that hugely impressive number is dependent on the labour market. So that's why today I can announce the Opportunities for All initiative, a commitment that every single 16 to 19-year-old in Scotland will be offered a learning or training place if they're not already in a job, a modern apprenticeship or in education. And Mr Russell, the Education Secretary, will announce further details of Opportunities for All in his statement next week. This Government's key policy focus on delivering growth. This is part of an ambitious plan for Scotland. In recent years, over the last year, we've been able to attract major international companies to Scotland. In the last 12 months, Amazon, Gamesa, State Street, Doosan Power, Ryanair, EasyJet, Tesco Bank, Virgin Money, BlackRock, Ineos PetroChina and Mitsubishi Power Systems will increase our efforts in the months ahead to attract even more major international companies to Scotland. We'll announce in the autumn our plans for enterprise areas to attract new investments and jobs to Scotland. We will work tirelessly to improve our links with those economies that buy our goods and services because we recognise the importance of export growth in Scotland. The Scottish Investment Bank therefore will prioritise lending to small and medium-sized businesses with international ambitions as part of that growth strategy. We have set a target to increase the value of international exports from Scotland by 50% over the next 6 years. Our food and drink sector, our farming and fisheries are a key part of what Scotland offers to the world. In June 2010, Scottish food exports broke the £1 billion barrier for the first time. But here as elsewhere, we can't simply rest on our laurels. So a bill on agricultural holdings will encourage landlords to increase the availability of farming tenancies and support new blood to enter farming. And we are developing consultation proposals with a view for legislation to support the development and necessary expansion of farm fish and wild salmon and freshwater fisheries. In normal economic times, we would use public service reform to help drive that economic growth. But in the context of the unprecedented and extended real cuts being made to our budget over the coming years, it becomes even more important as that is a component of this Government's programme. If we are to maintain the levels of public services that we all want, we need to do things smarter and better. We therefore appointed the Christie Commission to look at ways to reform public services while also improving them. Christie recommended an emphasis on collaboration. Our public services cannot operate in silos. There was also a focus on investing in prevention, which in the longer term can save money too. We will publish the response to Christie in the very near future. In health, we will take action to improve the early detection of cancer. Our bill on minimum pricing for alcohol will tackle the scourge of alcoholism in Scottish society and Scottish families. We will ensure that services are organised around the needs of the individual by integrating health and social care. A bill on self-directed support will put those of the receiving care at the heart of decision-making about that care, and will deliver our commitments to carers and young carers in particular around better information, respite and support. In addition, in education, we will introduce far-reaching reforms of our post-16 learning and student support. We will set these out in a pre-legislative paper. And let me affirm our absolute commitment to keep university education free for Scottish students, so that access to education in our country is based on the ability to learn. To demonstrate our commitment to young people, we will introduce a Rights of Children and Young People Bill, and indeed we're launching the consultation on that tomorrow. We'll begin and introduce an Early Years Change Fund and build on our Children's Rights Bill in the next session with a Children's Services Bill. We will develop family centres, a national parenting strategy and a modern career service, always with a focus on those in the greatest need. We will introduce a European-style system of language teaching and a new programme of Scottish studies, so that our children can acquire a deeper understanding of their own diverse culture and Scotland's place in the wider world. Now, our colleagues in the Conservative benches have dismissed Scottish studies as indoctrination. I cannot imagine any other nation where teaching your own history, arts and literature in an impartial way would be dismissed in such a negative fashion. It's all the more surprising given the newfound Conservative interest in their own history. Perhaps history also teaches us that success takes more than a change of name, but also a change of attitude towards Scotland. In justice, we will make Scotland a safer country by rolling out the No Knives, Better Lives programme, bring forward a radical reform of courts and tribunals under the Making Justice Work programme, and progress the Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Scotland Bill to crack down on violent and bigoted behaviour. Official statistics published yesterday report that crime levels in our country are now at the lowest level since 1976, 35 years ago. Separate figures also confirm police numbers remain well above our target to keep 1,000 additional officers in Scotland's communities. Scots are feeling safer. 71% say that local crime has improved or stayed the same in 2009-10 compared to 65% in 2006. 94% of Scots now rate their neighbourhood as a very or fairly good place to live. But there is widespread recognition that reform is needed so we can create services fit for 21st century Scotland, despite the London cuts. Communities don't care about boundaries. They want services to work effectively and efficiently. After detailed consideration of all the evidence available, we are persuaded that a single police service and a single fire and rescue service are the right options. This is the only way, in terms of the police service, to maintain the number of officers in every community right across Scotland. It will sustain and improve the delivery of local services, while giving all parts of Scotland access to national expertise and assets whenever and wherever they are needed. And the reform will enhance national governance, ensuring a clear separation from ministers to ensure the continued operational independence of these vital services. Today, I am announcing our intention to move towards single services. Tomorrow, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice will provide Parliament with further information, including how we will seek views on the options for how the new services work in detail. This programme for government economic strategy, the spending review, set out how we will make full use of the economic levers currently devolved to the Scottish Parliament with the aim of improving Scotland's rate of sustainable economic growth. But it's also important to reflect on the type of country and economy we want to be in future. In May, the people of Scotland voted for change. They want this Parliament to have the control, flexibility and freedom to make the decisions that are right for Scotland. Many of the key job-creating powers, particularly in relation to taxation and central elements of economic policy, lie outside the remit of the Scottish Government. Around 90% of Scotland's revenues are collected by Westminster and are not set with any reference to economic circumstances here or the preferences and needs of our businesses and households. With greater responsibility, we can address these needs. The Scotland Bill, as it stands, fails to make things better. The tax proposals that are designed are potentially damaging and could result in less funding for Scotland. Even more importantly, they provide no meaningful economic levers and fail to give Scotland power over its own wealth and its own resources. We will look to work with the Westminster Government and its Parliament to strengthen the Scotland Bill into legislation that really takes Scotland forward. I mentioned earlier the Conservative Party could benefit from knowing its own history. That applies to the Labour and Liberal Democrats as well. They should, for example, remember the claim of right they signed before the establishment of this Parliament. Let me remind the Chamber of what it said. We do hereby acknowledge the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, and do hereby declare and pledge that all our actions and deliberations, their interests, shall be paramount. In May, the people of Scotland determined that they wanted key additions to the Scotland Bill. It is now the duty of the claim of right parties to respond to the express will of the Scottish people. I urge them to remember their own past, their own principles, and join us in recognising the sovereign right of our people to determine the form of government they want here in Scotland. Today we unveil a programme for government. practical measures to make our citizens safer and healthier, capital investment to aid our recovery. I would welcome constructive ideas across the chamber on how to make Scotland better. Making Scotland better is the focus of this government. It's one reason why we won a historic victory in May. It was a recognition of proven competence and commitment. But yes, it was also about Scotland and our nation's future. The people are ready to move on to the next chapter of Scotland's story. The first objective in the Constitution, as we set out in our election campaign, to deliver much-needed new job-creating powers for this Parliament. Those voters who put their trust in us also understand the SNP believe in independence. They understand it and they do not fear it. We have won their trust and we will not abuse it. We know they are listening, keen to hear the positive story we have to tell about the future. Their future as parents, students, workers, pensioners, carers, entrepreneurs, professionals. They share our excitement about the project at hand to build a better nation. Independence will improve the future for all these people. It will be an independence generation. It is the opposite of dependence, of limited ambition, of negativity, of caution, of pessimism. It means rejecting those who tell us we are too lazy or too poor. Scotland, in fact, is in a better financial position than the UK as a whole. We have been, for example, in current surplus for 4 out of the last 5 years recorded. We also know that many of our most successful sons and daughters, Jim McCall, Tom Hunter, Audrey Baxter, Martin Gilbert, support more economic power, real economic power for Scotland. Our population is growing, numerically, as well as growing in confidence. And it is that population made up of millions of individuals and families, of communities and businesses who lie at the centre of this programme for government, the government economic strategy, the spending review. Our agenda for this government is global in its spirit. It listens to those voices of economic sanity, urging world leaders to invest for the future. It takes note of the words of Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, who warns of the danger austerity poses to recovery. It's a response to Professor Stiglitz and to another leading economist, Nouriel Roubini, former advisor to President Bill Clinton. Professor Roubini is widely acknowledged as the man who best predicted the 2008 crash with his prescient warnings about the property bubble. Earlier this month, he said the nations of the world must move away from both the Anglo-Saxon model of laissez-faire and voodoo economics, and indeed the continental European model of deficit-driven states. He said, the right balance today requires creating jobs, partly through additional fiscal stimulus aimed at productive infrastructure investment. Scotland should heed these calls from some of the finest economic minds in the world. But our desire to introduce that growth and balance is threatened by the voodoo economics of the London Coalition, whose ministers lecture Scotland about our future. Let them start using their own powers wisely before they attack Scotland. A Scotland where sensible policies have employment above the UK average and unemployment below it, where in the last 3 months Scotland created 24,000 of the 25,000 aggregate jobs created across these islands. We therefore prefer to take advice, and much prefer to take advice from a Lagarde, a Stiglitz, a Roubini, than a Moore, an Alexander or a Mundell. This government prefers to think big for Scotland because this government knows where it's going. We have Scotland's interests at the heart of the programme I've outlined today. The people recognise that ambition and trust us to take Scotland further on its journey. So should this chamber.